If you take a workforce that is experiencing the post-pandemic hangover, they are experiencing higher levels of change fatigue than we've ever seen. They are under siege from CEOs that are saying, hey, we want you back in the office, regardless of whether that makes logical sense or not. We have the lowest levels of trust in organizations that we've seen historically. You're starting to see a picture building here. That's an opportunity. And the organizations that take that opportunity to go, what if I thought of work as a product that needs to be designed and employees as customers that we need to lure? That changes almost everything about how you think about the future of work.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming back the first person I ever interviewed for Work for Humans, Aaron McEwan. Back then, Aaron and I discussed large shifts in the workforce as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Great Resignation and remote work. But today, Aaron is sharing his most recent insights from Gartner's Rapid Response Market Sensing Team, which is a team that listens closely for signals in the market to get ahead of trends, disruptions, and challenges that are bubbling beneath the surface. As a prominent behavioral scientist, psychologist, and futurist based in Australia, Aaron currently serves as Vice President of Research and Advisory for Gartner's HR practice, providing strategic insights on talent management and the future of work to leading global companies. In this episode, Aaron and I talk about Gartner's Rapid Response Market Sensing Team, what market sensing entails, and the early detection of workforce disruptions. We also discuss the largest market challenges he's seen since the pandemic: social movements beginning to bubble up, social media-driven employee activism, and other topics. All right, if you enjoy the content on Work for Humans, make sure to show your support and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, I'm super excited to share my discussion with Aaron McEwan. Aaron McEwan, welcome to Work for Humans.
It's good to be back. Thanks.
And it's great to have you back. It's been 2 years, I think, since you first came on the show. And although you were the very second episode, you were the very first person I ever interviewed for Work for Humans. So you're on this team at Gartner, and it's called the Rapid Response Market Sensing Team. It sounds very Indiana Jones. It's like right on the leading edge of what's happening in HR and in people and in companies. And I really want to hear what's been going on in the last 2 years. So first of all, what's your role in relation to this team? And how did the team start?
My role in the team is I lead the market sensing activities. Market sensing is essentially what we're looking for are signals from the market that will help us get ahead of emerging trends before our clients start asking us about how to deal with them. So the goal of the team is really to be an early detection system. We learned a lot of lessons from the pandemic. And one of those lessons was that something as disruptive as COVID-19 was, it started somewhere. And there were early signals that it might become something that the rest of the world needed to be prepared for and respond to. As you know, I'm based here in Australia. So most of my work with clients, even though it's global, just because of the time zones, a lot of the work that I do is with clients that are based across Asia and Southeast Asia. So we very early back in 2020 started to get these signals that something unusual was happening in China. At that point, the rest of the world really wasn't thinking about this. I think there was probably 2, 3, maybe 4 people in the world that were saying, hey, the world could experience a global pandemic that could be hugely disruptive, but they were quiet voices in the wilderness. Our job is to pick up those quiet voices in the wilderness and amplify that signal to determine, is this something that we should pay attention to and be prepared to act upon, hence the rapid response part. So, what we did back at the very beginning of the pandemic was, for example, one of the first calls I ever took from a client on remote work was actually from a client based in Wuhan, China, that was facing the prospect of sending their entire workforce home overnight. And they were like, how do we do this? So our response at the time was, well, we don't have any kind of clear direction on how to do remote work at that type of scale, at that type of speed. So we had to very quickly work out, well, how do we support clients that are going through this? And so what we did was there had been some academic research done on remote workers. It was small populations, it was in contained environments. So we tried to work out, well, what can that tell us about the process that you would need to use, the things that you need to be prepared for? So we started to look at the existing academic literature. I happened to have a contact that was based in Hong Kong that was already picking up these signals from China, that had specifically done some research on remote workers versus in-office workers. So we quickly reached out to him. We got him onto a webinar, for example. And right at the beginning of the pandemic, we just launched a webinar for our clients that were based in Southeast Asia and broader Asia, Hong Kong, for example. And we were able to talk through, what is this emerging issue that we're seeing in China, and at that point starting to spread beyond China? How should our clients respond to this? And the other great thing about Gartner is, most people will know Gartner for the research that we do in the technology and IT sector. So, of course, remote working, and this is only available through hindsight, of course, but what we would call flexible hybrid, which has become the most dominant model post-pandemic and represents also the most superior model. So essentially, this is a version of hybrid where teams, leaders, and managers have the autonomy to determine when employees should work in the office versus not. They make that determination around what is the work that needs to be done, what's the best for our team to deliver on customer outcomes. So when we measure things like impact on productivity, performance, engagement, fatigue levels, all of those things, that model turns out to be the best, all other things being equal. So that's a model that lots of technology teams had been using within their IT departments for decades. So we actually knew quite a lot about how to run remote or flexible or hybrid teams. So it was a case of pulling all of these things together to start the early seeds of advice that we could provide to our clients.
So here's Gartner, which is, you have this kind of a global fingertip feel for what's going on in the world. I mean, what strikes me is, like, right this second, and this is why it's nice to pick this moment, that there's a million possible things that could emerge to us from the future right now. And if we start looking around, we could probably compile an encyclopedia of possible risks and of possible market challenges. But you just don't know which one's going to emerge until they do.
Until they do.
And it's not going to hit the whole world simultaneously. COVID was unusual in the sense that it hit very quickly in retrospect. Not that quickly. I remember sort of traveling around at the time and thinking, I bet that's coming, around March of that year, and still traveling and still knowing that it was in China and knowing that it was coming, but not having to sit down in the house yet. But looking back, it feels like the light switch just went off, but that's not the way it really was. So you've got this fingertip feel for the globe. And what are some of the other things that have popped up and that have emerged since that time?
Nothing quite as disruptive. We formed this team during those early stages of the pandemic and solidified things as we realized that actually this could be a really valuable approach if we were to work it out and scale it and embed it into our early detection process. But some of the things that have come along the way in the several years that I've been involved in this was the war in Ukraine, or the invasion of Ukraine. Really interesting one, because this sort of thing had not happened for a long time. invasions tended to happen, but they were in areas of the world that Gartner certainly wouldn't have a large number of clients. So it was an unusual event, and it threw up a whole bunch of really unexpected things. So I was part of a small team of analysts or advisors within Gartner that were tasked with fielding questions from clients that were related to Ukraine. And I got some bizarre ones. Obviously, I can't go into too much detail around these, but one of the first questions that came in was, we have employees based in Ukraine that we need to evacuate. And that was proving incredibly difficult because airports were being commandeered. So it was not easy to get out of Ukraine. So it turned out that there were a bunch of organizations that had operations in Ukraine that were essentially employing private militias and security outfits to form convoys to evacuate people from Ukraine. So we were able to essentially help connect those clients together so that they could coordinate their activities and get people out, not en masse, but certainly in a more scaled and, I was going to use the term safe, let's call it relatively safe way. That was fascinating to begin with. But one of the other more interesting ones was, as you can imagine, a lot of organizations, particularly heads of HR, that had operations or staff based in the Ukraine. And it's probably important to make this point because it wasn't well known at the time, but Ukraine was one of the most prominent areas for machine learning and AI skilled employees in the world. So a lot of organizations were essentially outsourcing early machine learning and AI development to Ukraine. That's probably not an area of disruption that anyone was really thinking about. And when we sit here now, a year into the impact of generative AI, I wonder how things might have been different should that conflict not be occurring in Ukraine, for example. A lot of organizations that had used these outsourced development operations, they didn't necessarily employ people. They were usually contractors, but those contractors were using those organizations' equipment, mostly in the form of laptops and PCs, servers, think all of that type of stuff. So your kind of immediate concern would be, well, what if Russian forces come in and they seize that equipment? And that was certainly how I was thinking about from a cybersecurity issue. But that wasn't actually the client's concerns. Their concerns were, look, we've got protocols for that. What we're really worried about is, what if our equipment is used by Ukrainian nationals to wage cyber warfare on Russia? So that was a bigger concern and one that you wouldn't really expect in terms of everything else that was happening during that conflict.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the sort of thing that you could waste a lot of time wargaming possible scenarios of the future of a conflict and not think of that one, right? If it wasn't in context. And what strikes me is that a lot of the things that are happening do get connected to each other. And it was partially, you were talking about how here's the war in Ukraine and it's affecting AI, for instance. I mean, the very fact that blockchain happened before AI has actually created this enormous capacity, this enormous computing capacity for supporting AI, which if it hadn't happened first and become less popular when it did, it might not have paved the way computationally for a lot of AI. So I can't remember who I was talking to or reading about who was in the business of converting blockchain data centers, basically, into AI data centers.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to a degree, that's predictable. Not necessarily that precise application, but rather here at Gartner, and I'm sure many of your listeners would have heard this, but we have a model called hype cycle. It's a way of tracking the relatively predictable adoption cycle of emerging or new technologies. In really simple terms, it starts off with an innovation that sparks a little bit of, I guess, hype amongst a very small community of people, but very quickly it gets up to what we call the peak of inflated expectations. So this is when a new technology seems to be the next best thing since sliced bread. It's going to change the world. It's going to revolutionize everything. Certainly, blockchain went through that in a very visual way. And then once it hits that peak of inflated expectations, relatively quickly, we start to realize that it's not quite as good as we thought it was, or it's going to be more expensive, or it's going to take more energy, or it's going to take more resources. Maybe it's not as widely applicable as we'd hoped. And then it falls down into what we call the trough of disillusionment. It won't stay there for long. Eventually, we'll find its use cases and its applications, and then it creeps its way into the mainstream. So, yeah, blockchain was always going to pave the way for technologies or applications that we could use in a mainstream way. AI will do the same. In terms of when we look at generative AI, it's just dipping down into the trough of disillusionment. So it's on that slope now. And you'll hear that with CEOs now saying, hey, look, we've dumped a lot of money into this. Where's the return? Or actually, it looks like this thing, it's a huge user of energy. So its application at this stage is not as wide scale or widespread as we thought it would be. But eventually, it too will mainstream and we'll wake up one day and it's embedded into all aspects of our lives. And in the same way that we're kind of starting to see blockchain do that now.
And it's interesting because there's a way in which that in the very early stages of some event, that hope, or honestly, it can go either way because in the case of COVID, it was fear, can be a very broad hope or a very broad fear because the possible futures at that time are quite uncertain. You know, it could go a lot of different ways. And so one of the things that happens early on is that everybody says they ascribe whatever magical power to the technology that they wished it had, which it might have, but nobody knows yet. And the same way with COVID, we ascribe, this broad range of possible futures for COVID, and only one of which of those futures is it really deadly. And in fact, it was quite deadly. It just wasn't as deadly as it could have been. And so there's something rational about the beginning of the hype cycle because you're trying to deal with what could be. The unknowns could be so big.
Yeah, it's very difficult to predict with any accuracy. So a lot of things are very clear in hindsight. So for example, we're talking about the hype cycle. We have applied the hype cycle to hybrid work. And we are right in the trough of disillusionment when it comes to hybrid work. This was an incredibly exciting innovation, although it wasn't really innovation. As I said before, there were pockets of use of this incredible way of working that were very effective before the pandemic. But what happened is that it went viral, no pun intended when we're talking about pandemics. But it very quickly spread all over the world. There was a lot of excitement about it. And I think that that excitement is still justified in terms of its ability to drive very positive outcomes for organizations and employees. But right now, we're facing this constant battle around should we drag people back to the office or not? And that's showing up in the form of office mandates. That's a predictable reaction to a new emerging approach when you apply something like a hype cycle to it. So we too will get through the trough of disillusionment when it comes to hybrid. And, a good example of this is that even prior to the pandemic, at Gartner, we were predicting that hybrid or remote work would become wide scale. We were just looking at a longer horizon. So we were thinking that that was 10 years away. But of course, what happened is the pandemic accelerated the adoption of that innovative way of working.
So I want to get to the interface between companies and the people who work at companies. So now I've got this mental model. I've got this mental model of the rapid response market sensing team with fingers all over the world, and you're feeling for the braille, you're feeling for those things that pop up that could be a thing. And some of them, turns out, are coming from biology, for instance. They're coming from COVID or bats or something or whatever. And they're coming from the meat markets of China, potentially. And some of them are coming in the form of war, but some of them are coming in the form of social movements and in different ways of thinking about work. and different expectations of work. And I'm wondering if there are any things that are bubbling up.
There's a few things, and I guess part of the art of this is trying to work out which signals you should pay attention to versus which you don't. So part of our job is to go, lots of things will get media attention or start buzzing. You'll hear buzzwords. One of the more recent buzzwords is a concept called resenteeism. So we've been through the Great Resignation, which was a thing, and we did pick up early signs of that, which was cool. That then evolved into the quiet quitting movement. You can see here that it's a kind of a level of intent or activity or maybe even energy. So the Great Resignation was very energized. People were making clear decisions. They were deciding to move from one organization to another. It kind of happened en masse, although, again, with hindsight, it may not have been that outside the normal, but we'd just come through the pandemic, which was a period of people not moving anywhere. So it looked like a bigger movement than it probably actually was in reality. But it did happen. People did move en masse. Then they stopped moving. And what they were doing then was, hey, look, I'm still not particularly happy where I am. I don't think this is necessarily the place that I want to be, but it looks a little bit too scary to move. Or maybe I was part of the Great Resignation and I've landed in a new job, and guess what? Grass isn't greener. So this time I'm just going to stay still. And that was more of a, not necessarily a disengagement, but I'm not going to go above and beyond. I'm just going to do my job and try and get through the day. Now we're picking up early signals of a small section of workforces that are actively disengaged. So this goes beyond just staying still, not wanting to quit, but actually being resentful of the situation that they find themselves in. Now, back in the 70s, 80s, 60s, when you had highly resentful individuals, we might have called that malingering. It might have turned up in unionization, so some type of industrial action. At its extremes, you might have seen what we used to call industrial sabotage, which was quite literally somebody throwing a spanner into the plant equipment. What could that look like today? So we've just seen CrowdStrike, for example. Now, I'm not going to comment on whether there was any maliciousness behind that. It doesn't appear to be the case. But if you take a small percentage of a workforce that is experiencing the post-pandemic hangover, they're still exhausted, they are experiencing higher levels of change fatigue than we've ever seen in organizations before. They are under siege from CEOs that are saying, hey, we want you back in the office, regardless of whether that makes logical sense or not. We have the lowest levels of trust in organizations that we've seen historically. So employees don't trust their employers and employers don't trust their employees. So you're starting to see a picture building here. Now, what we've got today is another trend which is emerging. So this is one of these early signals of what we're internally referring to as social media-driven employee activism. So this is where you see things like Work Talk or the Reddit anti-work subreddit. Employees are talking about their work experience and they are sharing that work experience on social media. Now, we've seen some early indicators of what could be possible with this. So, for example, there were a bunch of rideshare drivers that en masse decided that they were going to pull over to the side of the road and not work. Now, they're not part of a union. They're not part of traditional collective action from an employee or a workforce. But what they are part of is this new potential threat or opportunity, depending upon which side of the fence you sit on, where employees can very quickly, even if they are not connected by any formal structure. So, for example, tomorrow, every barista in the world could potentially say, I'm not making coffee today, regardless of their affiliations. So that's the power of social media. And so that's the kind of risk that, however unlikely, we should probably be thinking about. Now, the other one is whether employees decide that they're going to allow a breach of the organization's security systems from an IT perspective, or collectivize into a DDoS attack, for example. So we've seen how vulnerable organizations are with the CrowdStrike issue. What we haven't seen is disgruntled employees coordinating in such a way to drive an attack like that.
First of all, those risks, I've seen them. And one example was the drivers when I was in Medellin, Colombia. All the, I guess they were Uber drivers or taxi drivers, went on strike for a day, but they didn't just stop driving, they parked in the middle of the highway.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so the city stopped, especially because there's only one way in and out of the city to the airport. I think there's this tunnel. And I'm trying to remember exactly what it is, but it's, if you've parked there, that's it. There's no other way in or out. In another example, I was in Ukraine soon after the Orange Revolution. And the Orange Revolution was driven in part by the fact that for the first time ever, everybody had cell phones. And they had smartphones with cameras, and they could all have a coordinated action in ways that they hadn't been able to have before.
Yeah, that's right.
And so technology absolutely can. It can coordinate action. In groups that, unlike in Ukraine for the Orange Revolution, in groups that are never physically co-located.
That's exactly right.
And so it's not like there's a union meeting where everybody gets together in person and there's a town hall or something. Everybody talks. They don't do that. They don't have to. They're not co-located. But as a distributed group, they can, and they can coordinate action.
Yeah, and so that to me is a really good example of what the rapid response team is trying to do. So we have particular criteria that we apply to things to work out, whether this is going to be something that we should pay attention to. And that's often based around its ability to scale or the level of potential disruption or opportunity that it could bring. So we're not just randomly paying attention to signals. It's about looking at whether we're seeing these patterns. It's not necessarily whether something is likely to happen, but the level of disruption that could be brought by that should it happen. And I think that's part of a good early signal detection approach.
I wonder if you should, and if you do, look for anti-signals. And what I mean by that is everybody's expecting something to happen, and early signs are that it's not happening.
Well, we do, actually. This doesn't form a huge part of what we're analyzing, but we look at what our clients are asking for help with. Questions that clients ask that we don't have an answer or position to. Once upon a time, that would have just gone into a black box. It'd be like if, we had a hardware store and somebody came in and said, "Can I buy a television?" And we go, "No, we don't sell televisions, but, you can go down to the big box store down the road and get one." We actually pay specific attention to those questions. Our theory or our assumption is that they could hold the early signals of an issue that doesn't yet have a label or isn't clearly articulated. For us, it's as valuable a signal as any other. But what we will look out for is if our clients stop asking for help on things. That's usually a good indication that we probably shouldn't spend too many resources on it and write too much research on it or do too much data analysis. Now, we don't always make that assumption, by the way, because it could be cyclical. It could be in response to something that's happening in the environment.
And I suppose another way to ask an adjacent question is, people need rapid response to threats. Also, if there's rapid response to opportunities.
Absolutely. We don't think about it as threats, otherwise we would call it the threat detection team.
Right? Oh, that's right.
Yeah. So
it's market sensing. It's not threat sensing.
Yeah. We take the approach, and it's built into our criteria that these things could be opportunities or threats. So if there's a huge opportunity that some shift in the environment, and there's a whole bunch of methodologies we use, people would be familiar with things like PESTLE, for example. So we have lots of ways of looking at emerging trends. And we have some really cool internal processes for that as well that sit well beyond, the rapid response team that I sit in. We have a specific area of research every year that we call Maverick research. So this is where we fund and support and provide space for some of the sharpest minds in Gartner to go and research an unexpected or maverick idea or prediction. That's a really healthy thing because it doesn't just focus on threats, it very much focuses on opportunities. Here's a weird one that's popping up. There's a lot of solar farms being built on existing farms. And where I live in the world, we have a lot of sunlight. And I grew up out in the country in what we would call the outback, lots of sheep farming, lots of beef farming, for example. And you go out to these farms. I spent a lot of time on these farms as a child, and there might be one lone tree in a 1,000-acre field. And all of these poor sheep have to take turns sitting under this tree to get some shade in the middle of the blazing hot 38, 40 degree Celsius. So it turns out when you put solar farms on existing sheep farms, nobody has to fight for shade under a tree, and you end up with healthier sheep and you end up with better wool outcomes. So there's lots of these weird things where an emerging technology has an unexpected positive outcome. And so if you're a sheep farmer today, hey, come put a solar farm. You can have the land. Not have it, but you can certainly lease it for a fee.
Right. Wow. That's encouraging. So I came in and I spoke to Gartner, and now it really makes me wonder who was listening. I didn't really think about it at the time, and whether or not maybe it started some maverick research. Maybe it did.
It very well may have. I guess the fundamental concept of work for humans is, should we think of work as a product? Should we think of employees as consumers or customers? I think you would be amazed at how far that spark of an idea has spread. We used to talk about ripples. I suspect there's some, maybe not tsunamis, but there's some pretty good big ocean waves crashing on some organizational beaches out there. So, yeah, that's the sort of opportunity that we're trying to unearth. Not just a threat, that's an opportunity. And the organizations that take that opportunity to go, what if I thought of work as a product that needs to be designed and employees as customers that we need to lure? That changes almost everything about how you think about the future of work.
But now, when that idea comes out in my article in the Harvard Business Review in November of 2024, you guys will at least have heard of it before and have already been thinking about it.
This is the interesting thing about picking up signals from the market and forming a rapid response. That's why I listen to your podcast. I mean, A, it's a great podcast, but B, it gives me a lot of material for these signals. And in fact, it's one of the things that I love about podcasts. And that is that research production, whether it's academic or quasi-academic, takes a long time. I've learned this myself the hard way. It's like, if I write something down, I get super perfectionistic about it. Because it's a thing, it's there, it exists in a material world. So I pay a lot of attention to what I hear in podcasts, because what guests say in a podcast might not turn up in a book for several years.
Well, and this is actually one of the things about a lot of the academic journals is that they won't publish something until it's measurable, and it won't be measurable until it's been done. And so it's hard to talk about hypothetical things that haven't happened yet in that format.
That's exactly right. One of the first things I learned in terms of research methodology was, what do you do with outliers?
Yeah.
Well, you scrub
What
them
do
from
you
the
do with
data.
outliers?
Yes, you turn down the signal. That was a lesson that disturbed me, at the earliest stages of my career. And thankfully, I've just forgotten the author's name, but Black Swan, when that book was published, it was like a validation of this undergraduate view I had of research, which was, why are we ignoring these outliers? Yes, it might be statistically unusual, but could that be, for example, an early signal? Again, that's the sort of thing that we're looking for, or as outliers.
Well, it's an interesting thing about the outliers, because a lot of times we talk about outliers as if they're a static data point, but sometimes outliers are self-replicating, and so if that's the case, then sure, there's only one. But there were only two rabbits in Australia once, and there's a lot more rabbits in Australia now.
They were outliers in the most literal sense. And that's another kind of guiding principle for me is the concept of phase transitions. One of the things I'm looking for in signals is not necessarily the volume of the signal itself, but rather the volume of the pressure around that signal. So if there are a lot of other things that might be contributing to something, then it can sometimes flip into a phase transition. I think that's what we saw with remote work. We had known for years that employees wanted more flexibility. They wanted to work from home. They simply couldn't because it wasn't the culture. And there were all of these other things that prevented employees from doing this thing. But guess what? When you apply enough pressure to that situation, which is what the pandemic did, all of a sudden it flipped. In 48 hours, a huge percentage of the world's working population were working remotely.
And I'll tell you what, it's the sort of thing that I see. It's interesting to see it because it's popping up in different places. And it seems to be popping up, well, independently, but the way I listen is not statistically sound in the sense that it's not a random sample at all. So I will tell you what I'm hearing is that the combination of design and work are coming together in a lot of different places. And so Patagonia hired a company called Design Gym, and they did a study of the retail worker experience. And that study taught them a lot of things. First of all, there's huge diversity in what employees wanted in their retail work experience, by which I mean their experience of working retail. And they found that managers needed to up their game in order to be able to listen to the variety of what employees wanted.
But of course, what we also know about customers is that they don't want too much choice.
Yeah, not too much choice.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I know, right?
And these are the kinds of things that make me very confident that something like hybrid work is not going away, despite the rhetoric that we hear around the office mandate argument, is because you just need to look at consumer behavior. There's a reason why it's difficult to get people to go to the movies. And a lot of the way that I think about remote and hybrid work, you can see in that little tiny ecosystem. Going to the movies is inconvenient, takes a lot of effort. You have to deal with annoying other people. It's not your couch. It's not your popcorn. It's expensive, blah, 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 blah. These are all things that you just look at the average office and go, isn't that interesting? But guess what? There are pockets of employees that are going to the office and they're doing it to a degree willingly. It appears that if you're under 30, you live alone, the office is not a bad place to be in terms of access to the equipment that you need, access to a social group. So yeah, we have to be more nuanced. And to your point, really understand what different segment. I wouldn't even go this far. I get worried about talking about customer segments because what I know about humans is no one wants to be a segment, right? I want to be a unique snowflake. That's how I want the world to see me, at least if I'm from a traditional Western industrial part of the world. So how do you understand me as a snowflake and treat me as a snowflake without making me feel like I'm abnormal? There's your trick. Nut that one out and we probably unlock what the future of work looks like for employees.
I want to explore, are you getting any signal of re-emergent labor activism? And it's funny because when I think of labor, I think very old school Teamster, sort of unions. And I feel like, I don't know how it is in the rest of the world, but in the United States, the equilibrium has definitely moved away from labor power and has gone toward corporate power and management power. And so I feel like it's hit a steady state and it's not changing that much right now, but I could be wrong. Things could be popping up and maybe they're just not popping up in the United States yet. Maybe they're popping up in other places. But is labor rising that you can see?
Yes. And you're right. This plays out very differently in other places around the world. So I mentioned phase transitions before. You could look at this through that lens. You could look at it through complex adaptive systems theory. But one of the things you see in other parts of the world is the release of pressure valves. What I think the pandemic uncovered was that there was a deep-seated emerging problem, which was, for whatever reason, all around the world, employee rights were, to a degree, being pushed back. And certainly in most Western nations, obviously it plays out a little bit different in pockets of Europe, but let's say the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, many would have said, oh, the union thing is kind of over. They're losing membership, it's declining. And lots of legislation and laws were being enacted which made it increasingly difficult for strikes to occur, for example, for industrial action to occur. And so as a result of that, and things like austerity measures, we've been through a number of economic crises. So all of these kind of things combined meant that employees were working a lot harder than they'd maybe ever worked prior to the Industrial Revolution. Here in Australia, which is relatively benign when it comes to this stuff in comparison to the US, there was a well-identified chronic overworking problem. Then you get into, well, what was that doing to people? There's very clear evidence that it was killing them physically. So there's an absolute direct link between the number of additional hours that you work above your expectations and your likelihood for stroke and heart attack. And I think generally speaking, employees felt unwell in that well-being sense, right? And then you look at social. So there was this kind of social disintegration where people's lives revolved around their jobs. Often their social groups were formed around their work. And I think the biggest indicator for me of this was the Silicon Valley obsession with foosball tables and 24-hour cafeterias, this idea that you don't need a life. You can come work for us. We've got the t-shirts. We've got entertainment. You don't have to leave. We will provide everything for you. And then the pandemic hit. And it's like the mask was lifted and everyone went, my God, that seems like super creepy. And it's like, maybe I do need a life. Maybe I need a life because it's going to be better for my children. It's going to be better for my health. It's going to be better for my well-being. That to me was the true long-lasting impact of the pandemic, was that it changed the way people relate to work. It was a circuit breaker. I remember it as clear as day. I think it was May of 2020. Everyone had been sent home from work. And I was sitting in my backyard next to the pool, and there was just so many butterflies. I sat there and I was like, I can't remember seeing this many butterflies since I was a child living in the country. So this was in the middle of a relatively second largest city in New South Wales, where I live. And then I was like, is that because there's no one driving and the planes aren't flying? Or is it just that it's this time of year? Or is it just that I've got the time to see it? And I didn't know the answer to it. I still don't know the answer to it, but I don't care what the reason is. The lesson for me was, I can see clearly now. Right? And what was clear is that the way I had been working was not right. It was not sustainable. It was not good for the planet. It was not good for my children. There were many lessons like that. I probably, prior to the pandemic, I spent more time in the Qantas airline lounge than I spent at home.
Yeah, it's a good lounge. I'm just saying.
It's a great lounge. You know what? But it's not home.
No, it's not.
It's work. It is work, regardless of how nice it might be and how privileged it makes you feel. It is work and it's damaging. Anyway, we woke up en masse and started to question, what is the point of work? Where does it fit into our lives? And I think we're in the process now of getting the balance right. My argument would be, you probably shouldn't. Like, I met my wife at work. That's not going to happen anymore. Socially, it's a little weird now, right? So times change. But you probably shouldn't meet your life partner at work. There's a whole world of life out there, which is where you should be forming those types of things. So I think, to get back to your point, there's some evidence that union membership has begun to grow again post-pandemic. And I think that's to be expected because there's more of a focus on protecting the boundaries between work and life. Here in Australia, just this week, we've had the enactment of right to disconnect legislation, which is essentially designed to say, hey, employees don't own your life. When you go home, you have a right to not be thinking about work so that you can be more focused when you are at work. Now, we could debate whether that's good legislation or not. But to me, what it is, it's a signal that in some countries, that type of legislation, it's a release of the pressure valve. In the US, I worry there's not enough of those pressure valve releases. So if something does happen, it's more likely to be this kind of unexpected, unpredicted, mass social media driven collective action that becomes incredibly disruptive, more disruptive than it should have been.
Yeah, I got a signal on this last week. I posted a video clip on LinkedIn. And I post, several of these a week, and they normally get 10,000 views or something like that. This one got so far 1,700,000 views. So 2,000% more. And the topic was that Americans work too much. That's what the video clip was about. What was interesting about it was that, as far as I could tell, it didn't just go viral in the United States. It went viral across the world. Now, I don't know what that means. It could be a fluke. Is it the world saying, yeah, those Americans work too much? Or is it the world saying, yes, we all work too much?
Yes, and yes. I work for a global company. So the rapid response team that we're talking about here today, some of us are based here in Australia, some in India, some in the US. Most of my stakeholders are in the US. So just at an empathy level, when I hear about my US colleagues that I work with only getting access to 2 weeks of PTO per year, I have an empathetic response to that. And it's immediate. It's like, you guys work too hard. But that puts pressure on the rest of us that are trying not to. Everyone kind of understands the concept of American exceptionalism. But what happens in America impacts the rest of the world. We worry about your election cycles way more than we probably should, because they directly and indirectly affect us, as do your labor relations. They set precedents in global companies that are challenging. So absolutely, I'm not surprised that the collective response globally was, yeah, you guys work too hard. Many US-based employers probably don't know this, but their employees are going on Reddit and TikTok and Instagram, and they are talking about the experiences that they have. But these are global conversations. So the Europeans are also talking about their experiences of having 6 weeks annual leave, or the Italians saying, hey, we don't work in August at all. Or if my boss yelled at me, that's just not going to happen here. They could go to jail for doing that. What's happening, which I didn't think happened before, is that we have this direct access to the work experiences of people all over the world. And they are not the same. And there are clear differences. I think even my US colleagues underestimate how powerful this early signal is, that the future of work in the United States is being heavily influenced by the experience of workers in Belgium, Sydney, the UK. This is filtering in, and it's starting to shape the way US employees think about work. Now, I don't know, what's more likely to happen? That en masse they say, you Europeans are crazy. As if, why would you give somebody extended maternity leave. Why would you let any crazy person have 8 weeks of annual leave per year? No. Like, some might say that, right? And you will pick that up in the political rhetoric, but this is a big signal. And it's one that US employers in particular should be paying attention to, because you don't have the pressure valve releases.
I will tell you, just hearing those stories, it influences me. I'm like, what am I doing? I don't have to work. And so why am I working my ass off?
We're social animals. So social comparisons are really fascinating from a psychological perspective, right?
I will tell you that when I was reducing the amount of my day job, a part of me said, I'm just not sure I exist if I don't work. I think it's a very American attitude.
Absolutely. That was the key existential crisis that I faced when I was sitting there noticing the butterflies. That's precisely what I went through was, well, if I'm not frequent flying executive with this cool job, what am I? And thank goodness I had the space in my mind and the space in my world where I could say, I'm a father, I'm a friend, I'm a partner, I'm many things. I've always been struck by the fact that the sale of guitars went up by like 16% during the pandemic. That's exactly what happened. People started reconnecting with interests and hobbies. I now play squash 4 times a week. Not only am I maybe in the best physical shape I've been in since my late 20s, but I refuse to commit to anything that means that I can't play those squash events in the evening. That creates challenges in a global organization, but I've realized that I have to set those boundaries, because if I don't set those boundaries, work will creep in and it will take over. So, yeah, it's interesting that just this week Australia has implemented the right to disconnect legislation, which is precisely designed to protect that. And that's one of the challenges in the US system is, what's the likelihood of legislation being enacted in that way? It's probably quite low, I suspect, although not completely out of the realms of possibility. So what that will mean is that employees will have to protect that for themselves, and or it becomes a differentiator for the acquisition of more customers. Here's something that Rapid Response solved for. During the pandemic, we were advising our clients, and this becomes particularly interesting because one of the other signals we're picking up is the increase in employee conflict in the lead up to the US election. So we're seeing early signals of this kind of raised level of conflict.
With each other, employee conflict with each other?
Yeah, with each other and with their employers, and but with each other is what we're picking up. One of the things that we would usually say is organizations should not only have a position on social issues, but they probably should act on them. And the data from a few years ago showed that the companies that acted on social issues had more engaged employees, they were better at attracting them. I don't think we can count on that anymore because of the level of polarization that we're seeing, particularly in the US. So now taking a position on a controversial social issue is pretty dangerous. And so what is that forcing organizations to do? Well, they're taking positions on vanilla ice cream and nobody cares about it. So it doesn't give you the positive impact if you're, so unless you're like a Patagonia where you've got a very clear mission that's connected to all parts of your own. If you employ 250,000 employees, what are the chances that you'll find a social position that is inoffensive to everyone, but is able to ignite their passions? And I think that's quite low.
I've certainly seen conflicts. I've seen conflicts in Silicon Valley companies going to other parts of the United States with a policy and facing really stiff resistance and then, needing to support it. So for instance, things around transgender. California is super socially progressive, but you take those ideas to Georgia or something, And people are saying, this does not agree with my values.
Well, for me, what we're talking about right now is one of the clearest signals that employees are now starting to behave more like customers than employees. Because an employee 10 years ago would have gone, oh, okay, if that's the company's view, well, I'll leave my views at the doorstep. And when I walk in here, I'm an employee. That's not what employees are thinking today. What they're thinking is, that's none of your business. What I think and how I live my life is not for you to have, as my employer, anything to do with. So just give me good work to do and keep your nose out of my business. And that is also another example of the way that the pandemic has changed things. It just broke that kind of hold that organizations had over their employees. So employees now go, I'm an agent with autonomy. I'm not wearing your t-shirts. I'm not plastering your logos all over my walls. I'm an individual and I'm a customer. So if you want me to come and live and be part of your organization, then they're starting to say, well, what's in it for me?
Was it you who told me about hearing leaders of companies saying, we just need a good recession to get everybody back in their place? Was that you?
Yeah, that's literally a quote I heard in a room full of, I think there was 15 CEOs. And ironically, it's a funny story because I'd been invited to speak to this forum of CEOs. It was about what was happening in China. It was the very last in-person presentation that I did to a room of executives before the pandemic broke. So there were 2 conversations happening in that room when I walked in. By the way, the CEOs didn't know who I was. They probably just thought I was another CEO, but I was the guest speaker, I guess. So one conversation was a CEO who'd just come back from China saying, I've just come back from China and they had literally walled up an entire neighborhood. There were dead bodies in the street and there were people locked in their apartments. And this thing's coming. Bizarre conversation to have. But the other conversation was, all we need is a good recession, and that will get these pesky employees to get back to the office where they belong.
So I've asked you this question before because you've been on the show before, but it was 2 years ago. So I asked you back then, what job do you hire your job to do for you? And at that time, what you said, if I remember correctly, is, I hire it to give me a stage and an audience. And when you were flying around the world all the time doing that kind of work, you had a stage and an audience. Has your answer changed?
Yeah, I don't fly around the world and jump on stages much anymore. I still do some of that stuff virtually, but nowhere near the volume when we last spoke. So yeah, today it is a slightly different answer. I hire my job to have super interesting conversations with really diverse and interesting people. I hire it to help me to continue learning, but in particular, I love what the rapid response team does. This idea of unearthing early signals and understanding patterns. Maybe I'm going to sound like a conspiracy theorist, to know that something interesting is happening before anybody else does. I'm going to have to keep an eye on that.
So you like to take that little piece of string and you like to put the pin in the wall and then you connect it to the other thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
To another string? I know what your garage looks like.
I think what I've really learned is I hire my job to give me the flexibility and autonomy to be a good father and a good partner. That's probably the biggest change since the pandemic. I can see very clearly where work belongs and what it gives me, but I can also see what it doesn't.
You said something a couple of years ago that I quote occasionally, which is, we were talking about what human work is, and you said human work knows its place. And that's really struck with me. I didn't ask this question last time because I hadn't started asking this question yet, but what does your job cost you?
Oh, my sanity sometimes, I think. I guess one of the things about all big, large, complex global organizations is they're difficult to navigate. It takes a lot of effort and energy to work through, whether it's politics or whether it's internal structures or whatever it might be. So, yeah, my job costs me a lot of frustration sometimes because I can't get to the answers or get the action that I want. But to my point earlier, sometimes that's not a bad thing. It's kind of a counterweight. It allows you a little bit more time to test your ideas and work out which ones are worth shouting at the clouds about versus the ones that aren't. It's ironic. It drives me crazy, but it keeps my sanity in check at the same time.
Where can people learn more about you and your work?
LinkedIn is the best place, so feel free to reach out, Aaron McEwan. And if you're interested in the kind of work that the rapid response team does, you won't see all of it, but we do publish a lot of the end result of all of that on Smarter with Gartner, which is a section of the Gartner website. So go to gartner.com, look up Smarter with Gartner. That's the stuff that sits outside of our paywall, things that we think you should know about and we're happy to share. And one of the cool things, this is the great thing that came out of the pandemic, is that we built a COVID-19 resource center, which was the collection of everything we knew about what was happening with that pandemic, and we made it free. So that was something that we didn't hold on to for our clients. It was just there. Anyone could access the COVID-19 resource center. And we've since built those things for things like generative AI, for example, which was the next big pandemic-worthy trend that everybody needed to be aware of. So it's a great place to go to read about all sorts of things.
Thank you very much for coming on the show. I really appreciate hearing your perspectives on the evolving frontiers of work.
My absolute pleasure, as always.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.